Imagine this. A single candle flickers inside a stone cell. Rain lashes the narrow window. A woman in a nun's habit, barely 30, face pale as the moon, lifts a straight razor to her own reflection. Her hand doesn't shake. Her eyes are clear. She whispers one last prayer, and drags the blade across her nose. Not once. Twice. Then her upper lip. Blood pours. She doesn't scream. She just turns to the sisters behind her and says, in a voice thick with pain but steady as stone, "Better this than what they will do to us." That, my friends, is where our story begins. Not with swords clashing or treasure chests spilling, but with a choice no woman should ever have to make. Welcome to Lost History. The year is 870. The place is Coldingham Abbey, perched on the wild, wind-bitten coast where Scotland meets the North Sea. Picture it, grey stone walls half swallowed by fog, a small wooden church, a handful of thatched cells, and a garden of herbs the sisters tended with calloused hands. This wasn't some grand cathedral. It was home to maybe 40 women who had given everything, family, future, flesh, to live as brides of Christ. The air smelled of peat smoke, salted herring, and the constant damp of the sea. At night you could hear the waves gnawing at the cliffs like something alive and hungry. The nuns rose before dawn, chanted the hours, copied manuscripts by rushlight, and believed, truly believed, that their virginity was the only treasure no one could steal. They were wrong. By 870 the Viking Age had already been raging for almost 80 years. It started at Lindisfarne in 793, that first lightning raid that left monks slaughtered on the altar and the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with blood. The anglo-saxon chronicle called them heathen men. Alcuin, the scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." But terror evolved. What began as smash-and-grab raids became something colder, more systematic. The great heathen army, led by men like Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, wasn't just looking for silver anymore. They wanted bodies. Labor. Women. Slaves they called thralls. And in the Christian kingdoms of England and Scotland, the richest, most undefended concentrations of young women weren't in villages. They were behind convent walls. Monasteries and nunneries held gold chalices, jeweled crosses, embroidered vestments, easy to carry. But they also held something far more valuable on the open slave markets of Dublin and Æbbe, young, healthy, literate girls who had never known a man. Virgins. In Viking eyes, that tripled their price. To the nuns, though, that same virginity was their entire covenant with God. Lose it, and they lost heaven itself. 4 months the whispers had crawled up the coast. Vikings had burned Whitby. They had carried off the sisters at Minster in Thanet. A survivor from Jarrow spoke of girls dragged onto longships, screaming, while the men laughed in a language that sounded like wolves. Abbess Æbbe, later remembered as Saint Æbbe the Younger, kept her flock calm. She led extra prayers. She hid the relics. She told the younger nuns that faith would protect them. But every night she lay awake listening to the sea, knowing the truth no one dared speak aloud. If the Vikings came, death would be a mercy. What they planned to do first would be something far darker. It was late autumn. The harvest was in. The sisters were singing vespers when the lookout on the cliff began ringing the bell like the world was ending. They came out of the mist, 30 longships, dragon heads snarling, oars flashing like teeth. No warning. No time to flee to Canterbury like they had before. The gates were flimsy. The walls low. The Vikings poured over them in minutes. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Older nuns and the abbess's senior sisters were cut down where they stood, quick, almost businesslike. The men wanted no trouble from them. But the younger ones, the novices, the ones with smooth skin and terrified eyes, those they spared. They dragged them out by their veils. Ripped the habits. Laughed when the crosses clattered to the floor. One girl, Sister Edith, barely 18, tried to run. A Viking caught her by the hair, slammed her against the stone wall, and told her in broken English what he was going to do to her before the ship even leaves the shore. The others were herded toward the beach like cattle. But Æbbe had been ready. She gathered the remaining sisters in the chapter house, maybe 20 of them now, the ones not yet taken. The screams from outside were already rising. The smell of smoke drifted under the door. She didn't preach. She didn't beg God for a miracle. She simply said, "My daughters, they will not have us as brides of Christ. They will make us their whores. They will break our bodies, then our souls, then sell what is left in markets where no priest will ever find us. I offer you another path." She laid the razor on the table. One by one they stepped forward. Some wept. Some prayed. Some did both. The blade passed from hand to hand. Blood pooled on the flagstones. Noses. Lips. Sometimes more. They wanted to be repulsive. They wanted the Vikings to look at them and feel sick. When the door finally burst open, the raiders stepped back. What they saw wasn't the soft, valuable prizes they'd expected. It was a line of bleeding, disfigured women staring at them with eyes that still burned with defiance. The Viking leader, some say it was a man who had already taken dozens of Christian women, actually hesitated. Then he spat, gave an order in Norse, and they did the only thing left. They barred the doors from the outside. Piled brush against the walls. Set the abbey on fire. The screams that rose from inside Coldingham that night weren't the screams of women being raped. They were the screams of women who had chosen fire over something they considered infinitely worse. Try to feel what they felt. You are 19 years old. You have never been kissed. You have never been alone with a man. Your entire identity is built on one promise: I belong to God alone. Every night you fall asleep believing that when you die, you will walk into paradise untouched. Then one morning the devils from the sea appear. You know what they do to captured women. The sagas don't hide it, they boast. Female thralls were used for pleasure, for breeding, for labor. A pretty Christian girl could be passed between crew members for weeks on the voyage home. Then sold. Then forced to bear sons who would grow up worshipping Odin instead of Christ. Her vows? Mocked. Her prayers? Laughed at. Her soul? Damned. Death by sword? Quick. Clean. Over. But this? This was eternal. That's why the razor felt like salvation. That's why fire felt like mercy. The most chilling part? Not every nun at Coldingham got the chance to choose the blade. Some had already been dragged to the ships. Chroniclers fall silent here. They don't describe what happened on those longships. They don't have to. We know the pattern from other raids, from Ireland, from Francia, from the slave markets of the north. The girls were stripped. Chained below deck. Used night after night while the oarsmen took turns. Some were blood-bonded, a crude Viking custom where a captor would force a woman to drink a mixture of his blood and hers, claiming her forever as property. Others were simply broken until they stopped fighting. When the ships finally reached Norway or Denmark, the prettiest ones were sold to jarls as concubines. The rest went to the fields or the beds of any man who could pay in silver. And the worst part? Many of them lived. They bore children. They learned the Norse tongue. Some even converted, or pretended to, just to survive. But every night, when the longhouse grew quiet, they remembered the convent. The Latin chants. The feel of the veil on their hair. The promise they had made to a God who, in their darkest hours, seemed to have looked away. That living death, that was what Æbbe and her sisters refused to accept. That was what they called worse than the flames. The abbey at Coldingham burned for 3 days. When the smoke finally cleared, the Vikings sailed away richer in gold and iron, but poorer in one thing they had come for: those untouched Christian souls. The story of Æbbe and her nuns survived only as a footnote in later chronicles. Roger of Wendover wrote it down centuries afterward. Some historians today call it legend. Maybe it is. But legends are born from terror so deep that people need to remember it somehow. And the terror was real. Because for every convent that burned with defiant, mutilated women inside, dozens of others quietly emptied. Girls disappeared into the slave trade. Vows were broken. Faith was shattered. Entire bloodlines of Christian devotion were erased one longship at a time. So the next time you hear someone romanticize the Vikings as noble explorers or misunderstood warriors, remember the razor on the table. Remember the smell of smoke. Remember the choice those nuns made. They didn't die for treasure. They didn't die for land. They died because what the Vikings offered them was something they feared more than death itself. And in that single, bloody act of defiance, they told the world exactly what kind of men had come out of the north. The kind who could make heaven itself feel safer than the alternative. Thanks for watching Lost History. If you want the even darker stories they tried to bury, the ones about what happened to the girls who didn't reach the razor in time, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Because some truths were never meant to be forgotten. Until next time, stay curious. Stay safe. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose how they leave this world.